Okay, here we go. Kinesiology 230, still in chapter 12, still talking flexibility. Now we're talking about factors affecting flexibility. Let's go ahead and jump right into this and get going. The book broadly categorizes different things regarding flexibility training, physiological, lifestyle, and environmental. And I've already alluded to a little bit of this in the previous presentation. And if we subcategorize these, you look at joint structure, how different people are made differently, muscle tissue, and different people are made differently in that regard as well, hyperlaxicity, age, sex, temperature, both the ambient temperature of the air, but also internal body temperature and muscle temperature as well, the level of activity of the person, but also there's a nuance here in terms of the activity level of the activity itself, right? It could be a very high intensity exercise versus a low intensity exercise, and that'll dictate range of motion constraints or demands, excuse me, and then resistance training as well. So let's take a look at this and see what they're getting into with this. When you look at the joints, and I took this from our 236 book, and it's a real good way to kind of look at like the different joints in the body. And if we have enothyroidal versus a ginglemus, you look at that and you go, okay, the hinge joint itself in the elbow, that doesn't have the same ability to articulate as a shoulder does, which is a ball and socket. By the way, the way I remember ball and socket for enothyroidal is enothyroidal reminds me very much of the word earth, which is like a globe, which is like the ball and socket. If it helps, I hope it helps. So the different joints have different range of motion. If you look at those two, you can already see that the range of motion is different. And if you're somebody who works out or has participated in any kind of activities, you know the range of motion for your elbow joint is way different than the range of motion for your shoulder or your hip. And the book notes that you have to think of flexibility as a characteristic of a joint as opposed to being a generalized trait for the person. But there are some people who are, in essence, just hyperlax. They're really flexible people. And the book notes that also you can't have one test that measures overall flexibility. So when we look at something like a sit and reach test, there's a little bit of like a quirkiness to that where it's like it doesn't measure the overall flexibility of the person globally. It's just for one particular area, for one particular movement pattern. So the book further subcategorizes into muscle. So the muscle itself, you have the joint capsules, the tendons, and the muscles. And the differences between individuals that you see with static range of motion are due to the elastic properties of the muscle and tendons across joints. And I would also contest that it has a little bit to do with the structure of the person as well, and also where perhaps the not just the elastic properties, but actually structurally how they're connected, where their muscle and the tendon more accurately attaches to the bone itself will make a difference. And then when muscle is held at fixed length under tension, the passive tension declines. This is called viscoelastic stress relaxation response. And this is from the book up here on page 272. So you have this fixed length under tension in a static stretch, and that the passive tension that you have that's the amount of force required to lengthen the relaxed muscle, right? And it declines as you hold that. So many times, like when you're stretching out, you'll stretch and hold for maybe 30 seconds. I'm reaching down for my toes right now, and I'm holding, and you'll feel like the muscle kind of give up. And like I've manually stretched, I don't know how many thousands of people in my career. But when you're stretching somebody, you'll feel the pushback. You'll feel that like vibration in their foot, that kind of response as the muscle spindles in the GTO are kind of working to reconcile if you're going to overstretch them or not, if they need to go into full protection mode. But eventually you start to have that sensory side start to dampen a little bit, and it starts to get a little bit quieter and quieter. And actually what ends up happening is you start feeling the muscle. I always jokingly say it's like, oh, your muscles are now finally giving up when I'm stretching a person, say like on a supine hamstring stretch. But what is happening is you're kind of winning over the muscle in that regard, and you've taken the person under tension in a static stretch to a length where they can't stretch much further, and you're applying force to this muscle. And eventually what happens is through this viscoelastic stress relaxation response, the muscle starts to just relax a little bit, and then you can go ahead and get a little more stretching, and then you push it a little bit further, and you get into something called like a PNF, like we've talked about, or I will talk about later on. I talk about hyperlaxicity. Um, it allows the joints of the body to move into a greater range of motion that might be allowed for the general population. You've all have friends who can do like the carnival trick type stuff with their elbow or their thumb, or turn their arm around when they're on the floor, just quirky stuff like that. But these are allowable because first of all, the joints involved with it are made in a way that they can structurally allow that range of motion to happen, but also there's a certain amount of laxicity in the actual musculature itself that allows that to happen. So there's a couple different things that go on there. Where this becomes a concern is if you have somebody's hyperlax, you have a client, they're doing leg press, and you ask them to go to full extension, and they go to full extension under load, and they actually hyperextend. One can only imagine if the knee goes 90 degrees the wrong way, how awful that would be for that client. So for some clients, they just don't have a real understanding that they're hyperlax, and they're actually going beyond terminal knee extension. They're actually going a couple degrees past into hyperextension. And you have to guide that person as a trainer or a physical therapist to be able to understand what is extension, what is hyperextension, what is really terminal knee extension when you work with them. And that way they don't end up injuring themselves. We're going to switch now. They talk with these other subcategories. One of them is age, and as we age, as we get older, it can have an impact on flexibility. You usually see this kind of like this slow erosive process. I often talk about this with my older clients where like you have these kind of erosive components of fitness and wellness, and flexibility is one. It's a perishable skill, and it's one we have to work at, otherwise we end up losing it. And so as a result, you have the relationship between age that actually helps to decrease our flexibility, but there is a relationship here where we also have tied into this is as we age, our overall levels of activity also tend to decrease, and that takes away from our ability to retain our flexibility. And I jokingly put it at the end here, but you got to move it or lose it, right? So in terms of when you're working with your clients, the fact that they're working with you tells you that they're trying to fight that erosive process of aging. If you have somebody who's like 50 some odd years old and they want to work out with you, they're trying to fight that process. But you also have to kind of guide them down a path of they may have already lost some of the functional capacity for flexibility, and you have to work with them to gain it back, and you have to work with them to help be able to retain and then regain some of the flexibility, or retain some of the flexibility they may have lost just through the process of aging. Now, with one of the other subcategories, we have sex here. Connective tissues of men and women differ physiologically. I like to say, muscle is muscle and bone is bone, but it's a little bit different for men and women. And here's the thing. When you look at the different hormonal responses that you have in females versus men, in terms of estrogen and testosterone coursing through our bodies, it makes a difference. And what you find is, one study here found there's a decrease in the musculotendinous stiffness of the knee flexors during ovulation. You start looking at these research studies, and it starts to answer some questions in terms of what happens during that cyclical process, what happens during the process of pregnancy when you have elastin increase to be able to relax the connective tissue to allow for the growth of a fetus and to allow for the delivery of a child. Those are processes that all happen to a female body. Now, what you also have is you're starting to get plenty of studies in place regarding the cyclical nature of ovulation and ACL tears and other tears in high school age and college age female athletes, because the concept there is a number of studies regarding like hip width and valgus and vargus, in terms of knee angle, etc. But you're starting to find that research is tying in more and more to the effects of, say, like estrogen and ACL ligament structure and function, which is this research piece down here. So I would urge you, if you have any kind of interest in this, or somebody who maybe blew out an ACL and they were in that age bucket, maybe take a look at a little bit of this research that's out there, because it's really kind of interesting to see how they tie and correlate these cyclical processes to a higher incidence of ACL injuries. Now, they also talk about temperature, and I mentioned this before. You have the ambient air temperature around you, that matters. And then also it is the core body temperature and the temperature of the muscle itself that's being worked. And all three of those help increase flexibility. So with warm-ups in general, you're starting with a generalized warm-up, then you get more specific to whatever muscle or activity you're going to do. Then you go into more dynamic flexibility. Then you actually do your activity. And then you go ahead and finish out with your foam roller and soft tissue work. I have a couple videos here that'll also help you in terms of that. Yeah, and sorry, before I jump to the next slide, these are a progression of high knee walk, a light skip, power skip, things that we do for a dynamic warm up in track and field, or part of like the ABC skip drills that you see in track and field, but this is just basically one category. It's the frontside mechanics. But the idea is you're doing a more generalized warm up to more specific, and then you go into more sprint oriented activities. But just so you know, you have 3 different videos to kind of guide you along that process. Let me go ahead and jump into the next slide. So when you look at the level of activity, right? And I bring this up in terms of 2 different contexts, one of which is people who are physically active, meaning they have a higher activity level, will tend to have greater levels of flexibility than non-active counterparts, which makes sense. You're moving around, you're moving muscles, and to contract one, you have to relax the other. Makes sense. And then when you look at the pliability of connective tissue as well, people who are not as active will have less pliable connective tissue. And even in the context of doing an activity, people will have to move differently in pickleball versus track and field versus basketball versus other activities. So you'll find that there's a little bit of different flexibility demands depending upon the activity that's being that the person participates in. And then they talk about range of motion. And within this, I talk about antagonist and agonist here, and I'm going to jump into one of these. So give me a second, I'll pause this. Okay, here we go. So with this, when you're doing a bicep curl, this is elbow flexion. As this happens and the bicep shortens, just think through what has to happen on the backside of the arm. The tricep has to what? 3, 2, 1. It has to elongate. And with that, you know that when you have frontside mechanics contracting the backside mechanics, there has to be a relax. And that happens here, and it's going to happen in the next video. Please hold. And so this is still elbow flexion and still elbow extension. But the difference is with the tricep extension, when we come down and we go up, we're lengthening the tricep here. We're shortening the bicep here under load. The weight is actually making that happen. And then when we go ahead and contract the tricep, the bar comes up. But to get to a shortened tricep, we have to have a bicep that's flexible enough to allow that to happen. Again, reciprocal inhibition has to be in place to allow that to happen, but also there has to be enough flexibility to make that happen. So let's see if we can just jump right into this next one. And now we do a plain boring bicep curl with weight, same idea under weight. As you contract on the front side, the back side has to lengthen. You have a shortening on one side, a lengthening on the other. And so as a result, you start to look at the body a little differently in terms of stretching. What is stretching? Because in this example, as we do our bicep curl, we know we're shortening the bicep. We're bringing, the Z's to the M, right? The Zweichen are coming into the mitral, and that's happening from cross-bridge attachments. But to allow that to happen, the backside has to relax. So let's get out of this and get back to this. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next presentation.